A Great Argead Saga Alexine, Alexander the Great. Volume 2, Hieros Lachus, The Sacred Band. By Macaulay Naki. Episode 21, Macedon, a House Divided. The winter settled over Pella like a funeral shroud. The assassination of King Alexander II during the festival dance had left the palace floor stained, and the air thick with the scent of wet iron. With the Theban general Pelopidas having marched away carrying the young Philip and 30 sons of the nobility as hostages, the court was a hollowed-out shell, vibrating with resentment. The great hall was drafty, the brazier struggling against the chill. Ptolemy of Illyrians sat not on the throne, but on a heavy gilded chair placed just before it, a calculated display of restraint. He had not murdered Alexander. He had desperately tried to steady a trembling crown, stepping in to act as regent because young Perdiccas was far too young and utterly devoid of the political experience required to navigate the ruthless geopolitical maneuvers tearing Macedon apart. Ptolemy had chosen to shoulder the burden of saving a broken kingdom from total collapse, yet he wore the purple-bordered chlamys of an Argead to a court that saw every protective move as a usurpation. To every noble eye, he was the architect who had plotted the king's death. To his right stood Parmenion, his shadow stretching long across the floorboards. "The Thebans are 5 days' march away," Parmenion whispered, his eyes scanning the tense faces of the gathered heteroi. "The boy Philip is in their hands. The nobility is quiet because their sons are in cages. They all believe you killed Alexander, Ptolemy. You might as well claim the full power to survive it." "I did not kill Alexander, Parmenion, and I'm not regent of a graveyard," Ptolemy snapped, though his eyes darted to the doorway. The heavy doors groaned open. Queen Eurydice entered first, her mourning robes trailing behind her like smoke. She was the mother of the murdered king and the mother of the boy now in Theban chains. Behind her came the young Perdiccas, his face a mask of fragile marble, the boy king who desperately needed a steady hand to guide him through the storm. Following them were the 3 sons of Gygia, Archelaus, Argead, and Menelaus. They moved in a tight phalanx, their hands never far from their belts. Gygia herself walked at the rear, her eyes meeting Ptolemy's with a cold serpentine fire. She was the other queen, the rival whose sons were watching the chaos, waiting for the regency to tear itself apart. "You sit comfortably, Ptolemy," Queen Eurydice said, her voice echoing off the limestone, "while my son Philip is dragged toward the Boeotian mud like a common slave. And while you pretend your hands are clean of my son's blood. I stepped in because Perdiccas cannot rule alone, Eurydice, and I did what was necessary to keep the Theban pikes from burning our homes," Ptolemy countered, his voice rising against the tide of silent accusations in the room. At his side, Euryno, the queen's own daughter and now Ptolemy's forced wife, looked down at her feet. She was the living bridge between the regency and the murdered house, her face pale and her spirit visibly flickering under the weight of a court that judged him for a crime he never committed. From the shadows near the weapon racks, a heavy tread announced the arrival of General Attalus. He was still in his travel-stained cuirass, the smell of horse and cold rain clinging to him. He didn't bow to Ptolemy. He stopped beside the young Perdiccas. "The army is asking questions, Ptolemy," Attalus said, his voice a low rumble. "They saw a king murdered at a dance. They saw the youngest prince taken as a prize. They look at you and see the shadow of regicide, wondering if the man holding the reins is a protector or a jailer." "Careful," General Parmenion warned, stepping forward with his hand resting near his sword hilt. "Sedition has a short life in this court. And so do usurpers," Archelaus interjected, his voice surprisingly steady for his age. He stepped toward the center of the room, his brothers Argead and Menelaus flanking him. "You let Philip be hauled away because you feared a true Argead prince. But we are still here. Perdiccas is still here." The dinner that followed was a masterpiece of silent warfare. Ptolemy sat at the head, with Euryno beside him, her hand trembling as she poured his wine. Across from them, the 2 queens, Eurydice and Gygia, sat in a rare, frozen alliance of grief and ambition, both silently blaming him for a crime he never committed, yet recognizing that only his steady hand stood between the kingdom and total ruin. "The Illyrians will hear of our weakness by the spring," Perdiccas said, looking directly at Ptolemy. It was the first time he had spoken with the true authority of his office. "They will come for the timber and the gold." "What will you give them then?" Another prince. Another sacrifice? Ptolemy slammed his cup down, the red wine sloshing across the wood. I will give them steel. If the boys in this room spent more time in the dirt learning warfare from Attalus and less time whispering treason in the dark with their mothers, we might yet have an army worth leading. Gygia leaned forward, a thin, dangerous smile on her lips. Then let it be so, Regent. My sons are ready for the dirt. But remember, a man who takes the crown by force to fix a broken kingdom shouldn't be surprised when the wolves learn how to tear him down. The feast of the dead had ended, but the hunger in the palace of Pella remained. As the torches in the great hall were extinguished one by one, the silence that followed was heavier than the music had been. The court dispersed like shadows retreating from a rising flame, and by midnight, the lines of the coming conflict were etched into the very stones of the city. In the high, wind-swept chambers of the North Tower, Ptolemy of Elorus paced the length of a Persian rug, his purple-bordered cloak of the Regency, discarded over the back of a carved chair. The room was cluttered with ledgers, tax rolls, and casualty reports, the dry, papery reality of a fractured state. He had never plotted the murder of King Alexander. He had stepped into the vacuum of power, not out of malice, but because young Perdiccas was far too young, utterly unseasoned, and completely unequipped to navigate the brutal geopolitical maneuvers required to keep Macedon from tearing itself apart. Ptolemy had chosen to shoulder the crushing burden of saving a broken kingdom from total collapse. Yet, to the court below, and to every suspicious noble eye, he was branded as the usurper who had plotted and executed the king's death. Parmenion sat by the hearth, poking at a dying fire with a bronze rod. To the casual observer, Parmenion was merely a fixture of the court, a man whose age was impossible to pin down, with silvered hair and skin the color of old vellum. He was the shadow of Pella, a master of the invisible mechanics of the state. He had served under Amyntas III and survived the bloody transition of Alexander II. He was a man who didn't care for the crown itself, but for the strings that moved the person wearing it. He was a creature of pragmatism, possessing a mind that functioned like a counting house, cold, precise, and entirely devoid of sentiment. Attalus is a problem, Ptolemy muttered, stopping to stare at a map of the Illyrian frontier. He looks at the boy Perdiccas and sees a legitimate king. He looks at me and sees a regicide, a temporary inconvenience standing in the way of justice. Parmenion didn't look up from the embers. Attalus is a soldier, he replied, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. He understands the pike, not the purse. He values bloodlines because they are predictable. But you, Regent, tasked with holding together a realm that hates you for saving it, must understand that loyalty in Macedon is a commodity, not a virtue. We have enough gold to keep the mercenary captains quiet through the winter, but by spring, the nobility will want their sons back from Thebes. If you cannot give them their children, you must give them a victory. Ptolemy turned, his face haggard in the firelight. And if the sons of Gygia become heroes in the process, then we make sure their heroism is final, Parmenion said softly, finally raising his eyes. They were a pale, piercing gray, devoid of warmth. A hero is much easier to manage when he is a statue in the agora, rather than a man with a sword. Count your coins, Ptolemy. I will count the spies. A half-mile away, the air was different. It didn't smell of expensive oils or stale wine. It smelled of wood smoke, wet leather, and the sharp metallic tang of whetstones. General Attalus led Perdiccas and the three brothers, Archelaus, Arrhidaeus, and Menelaus, into the heart.
Wolfmat.
The royal barracks. The veterans of the old guard sat around low fires, sharpening their spears in rhythmic, hypnotic strokes. They didn't stand when the princes entered. They watched with the flat, unblinking stares of men who had seen kings come and go like the seasons. Look at them, Attalus commanded, gesturing to the scarred men in the shadows. They don't care about your names, and they certainly don't care about the man sitting in the North Tower trying to piece this broken kingdom together. They care if you can hold a line when the Illyrian shields start to scream. Perdiccas stepped forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the hilt of a practiced sword. Then teach us, he said, his voice cracking slightly before settling into a hard, determined tone. Archelaus and his brothers stood behind him, a wall of youthful defiance. They were no longer the pampered fruit of the palace. They were the raw iron waiting for the hammer. The golden lamps of the queen's wing flickered, casting long skeletal shadows against walls draped in the finest Sidonian silks. To any outsider, the chambers of Urano were a testament to her high status as the wife of the regent. Ivory combs from Egypt sat atop cedar tables, and the air was heavy with the cloying, expensive scent of Athenian jasmine, the spoils of a woman who occupied the most powerful bed in Pella. Yet, despite the years she had spent bound to him, the luxury felt like a gilded layer of dust. Every jewel was a weight, and every silk hanging was a shroud, marking her not as a partner in power, but as the captive heartbeat of a dynasty Ptolemy had stolen. But to Urano, the room felt like a limestone tomb. She sat on the edge of the massive marriage bed, her fingers clutching the fine linen sheets until her knuckles turned white. She was the daughter of Queen Eurydice and the sister of two kings, one murdered in a dance of blood, the younger brother stolen away to Thebes in chains. Now, by the cruel mathematics of power, she had been forced into the bed of Ptolemy, the man who had orchestrated the ruin of her house. The door creaked and her mother, Queen Eurydice, stepped in. The older woman's face was a mask of frozen grief, her mourning robes rustling like dry leaves. "Dry your eyes, Urano," Eurydice said, her voice sounding like flint striking steel. "Tears are a luxury for those who have already lost everything. You are an Argead. Even in that man's bed, you are a spy for your blood. He says he didn't kill Alexander, but every time he touches me, mother, I feel Alexander's blood on his skin," Urano whispered, her voice trembling. "I look in the mirror and I don't see a queen. I see a traitor's prize. I see a hostage who has been taught to smile." "Then don't look in the mirror," a new voice interrupted. Gygia stepped out from the shadows of the adjoining chamber. The two queens, once bitter rivals who had fought for the favor of King Perdiccas III, now stood in a fragile, icy alliance. Gygia's eyes were sharp, reflecting the lamplight like a cat's. "The girl is right, Eurydice," Gygia said, her tone devoid of pity. "This palace is no longer a home. It is a cage. But even a cage has bars that can be sharpened into pikes." Eurydice turned to her rival, her jaw tight. "And your sons? The spare blood I spent years trying to push into the shadows. They are down in the mud with Atalos, becoming the very thing Ptolemy fears." "They are learning to hunt," Gygia replied simply. She walked to the window, looking down at the flickering torches of the barracks in the distance. "They know that the man sleeping in the room next to us is not a protector. He is the prey. And while he spends his nights trying to buy the loyalty of your daughter and the silence of the lords, my boys are growing their first real teeth." The three women stood in a heavy, vibrating silence. The rivalry that had defined their lives for a decade was eclipsed by a singular, cold realization. The men of their house were dead or exiled, and the survivors were surrounded by wolves. "We wait," Eurydice whispered, looking at the door that led to Ptolemy's private study. "We watch, we endure, and we wait for the boys to become men." Outside, the winter wind howled against the limestone walls of Pella, a mourning song for a kingdom in chaos. But inside the queen's wing, the grief was slowly turning into something much more dangerous, a quiet, patient hunger for revenge. Blueprint of Empire. Library of the Cadmea. In the quiet of the Theban night, beneath the towering stone arches of the Cadmea's ancient library, Pelopidas and Philip sat hunched over a detailed parchment map of a coastal city. Though drafted by a Theban cartographer, to Philip's sharp, homesick eyes, the sweeping curves of the harbor and the jagged tooth of the breakwater looked remarkably like Pella's own waterfront. Around them, the vast, shadowy hall was lined with scrolls of Attic philosophy, Spartan treaties, and military logs. Several rows over, Pamene stood quietly beside a tall reading desk, reviewing intelligence reports from the Peloponnese while keeping a watchful, protective eye on the young Macedonian prince. In the darker alcoves near the back, Antigonus, Pethan, Leonidas, and a mentor sat half-concealed by the stacks, ostensibly studying archival histories, though their true attention was fixed entirely on the tutor and his royal charge. "The torsion machine is a hammer, Philip," Pelopidas said, his finger tapping the inked bastions on the map. "But if you place it atop the tower with a swivel base, it becomes a shield. You can sweep the horizon, sinking ships before they can even lower their boarding planks." Philip leaned in, his gray eyes bright with intense analytical focus as his finger traced the defensive perimeter. He treats engine design like architecture, Philip thought, absorbing every syllable. If we integrate the engines into the walls themselves, rather than just placing them on top, we create a fortress that breathes fire. Thebes is safe behind her 7 gates, because she relies on a mob of citizens and divine luck. But Pella has always been too open to the sea, too vulnerable to naval raids. If we integrate the engines into the walls themselves, Philip said aloud, looking up at Pelopidas, rather than just placing them on top, we create a fortress that breathes fire. Then build a gate of iron and sinew. Pelopidas laughed, a deep, warm sound in the cavernous silence of the library. Completely unaware that the boy was memorizing every tactical suggestion for the day he would return north to fortify his own capital. Teach your brothers that the best way to win a siege is to ensure the enemy never reaches the wall. Philip nodded, his mind already calculating the number of Syracusan engines required to turn the Pella docks into an impenetrable forest of bronze bolts. He was learning how to protect a city, but he was also learning a darker, more ambitious truth, that a well-defended home is the only secure base for a kingdom that intends to expand. In the shadows of the adjacent isle, Antigonus shifted his weight, the leather of his boots creaking softly against the stone floor. Look at him soak it all in, Antigonus thought, his jaw tightening as he watched Philip trace the harbor lines. The Thebans think they are molding a compliant royal hostage, a decorative student of their hegemony. They don't realize they are handing a blueprint for conquest back to the Argeads. Pethan and Leonidas exchanged a sharp, knowing glance across a stack of historical chronicles. Every lesson Pelopidas gives him as a weapon sharpened against Greece, Leonidas calculated internally, a cold, thrilling realization dawning on him. When Philip goes back to Macedonia, he won't just rebuild a broken kingdom. He'll outthink every general south of Olympus. Amyntas leaned back against a wooden pillar, crossing his arms over his chest as he watched Pamines keep his vigilant watch over the table. The spy master watches the teacher, and the boy watches the map, Amyntas thought, his eyes narrowing in the dim candlelight. A strange, dangerous family forged in the belly of the beast. If Thebes falls in Thessaly, this library will be the birthplace of their undoing. Across the room, Pamines closed his dispatch scroll with a soft rustle of parchment. He looked over at the table where Pelopidas was now sketching a cross-section of a catapult spring for Philip. He loves the boy, Pamines mused quietly to himself, a hint of protective sorrow touching his thoughts. And the boy loves him like a father he cannot keep. In this cruel world of hostages and pikes, such affection is a fatal weakness or the only thing worth fighting for. At the map table, Philip caught Pamines' distant gaze, then looked back down at Pella's harbor lines. He said nothing, but his hand tightened over his stylus, his resolve hardening into something cold, brilliant, and unbreakable. The autumn dawn broke in a bruised wash of purple across the western highlands, the air thick with the sharp scent of wet pine and wood smoke. At the edge of a jagged clearing, young King Perdiccas stood not upon a sheltered royal dais, but ankle-deep in the damp mud of the frontline trenches. Ptolemy sits in his high tower in Pella, wrapped in his purple cloak and drowning in ledgers, believing he holds the kingdom together, Perdiccas thought, his grip tightening so hard around his belt dagger that his knuckles turned white. Let him keep his administrative seals and his empty titles. A king who stays behind castle walls is no king at all. They look at me and see a boy pushed around by regents and foreign chains. Today, I will show them what an Argead actually looks like. Beside him, acting as both his shield and his chief tactician, stood old General Attalus, a veteran of the brutal Illyrian massacres, whose face was etched with white line scars and the hard wisdom of decades at war. Attalus watched the boy king with a sharp, critical mixture of hope and deep skepticism. He moves with the stubborn fire of his father, but fire alone burns down houses, Attalus worried internally, eyeing the damp trenches and the experimental engines behind them. If the southern contraption fails to crack the gate, the veterans will lose all faith, and the boy will look like a fool playing with children's toys before the winter even sets in. Before them loomed the limestone outpost of Orestus. Its heavy oak gates were barred from within, and its crenellated walls bristled with the spears of a rebellious local lord who had brazenly declared his allegiance to Regent Ptolemy, gambling that the central court was too fractured to mount a punitive expedition. "The men are restless, my king," Attalus whispered, his weathered hand resting heavily on the pommel of his sword as he eyed the restless ranks of the phalanx behind them. They have never seen a battle won with wood and rope. They are sons of Macedon. They believe in the raw fury of the spear charge and the crushing weight of the shield wall, not in these foreign machines brought back from the south. Perdiccas did not look away from the barricaded gate, his gray eyes cold and resolute. Then we shall give them a new belief, General. He raised his hand and signaled sharply to a cluster of Syracusan engineers crouching behind a towering, cable-wound framework known as the Wall Breaker, a brutal siege engine, adapted from the tactical concepts Philip had studied in exile and smuggled back in letters of instruction. Philip sends his ideas across the mountains from his cage in Thebes, Perdiccas thought, a bitter, driving pride surging in his chest. Even from a hostage's hall, my brother shapes the future. But I am the one swinging the hammer here. Archedamus, Perdiccas called out over the rising wind. The distance is 200 paces, bringing the tension to the final notch. The sound that followed was a visceral, terrifying metallic groan, the torsion springs of twisted horsehair and sinew reaching their absolute breaking point. General Attalus instinctively flinched, his eyes widening as he watched the massive timber frame of the engine shiver with suppressed violent energy. By the gods, it sounds like a beast ready to snap its own spine, Attalus thought, a cold sweat breaking out across his scarred neck. If the cables fray now, Perdiccas commanded, his voice ringing with absolute authority. The triggerman struck the release hammer. There was a sharp whip-crack explosion of sound that shattered the morning silence like a thunderclap. The 6-foot, iron-tipped bolt did not arc gracefully like an arrow. It tore across the clearing in a flat, blinding line of gray motion screaming through the air. It struck the exact center of the reinforced oak gates with the unimaginable kinetic force of a falling mountain. Attalus watched in stunned, absolute silence as the massive timber doors did not merely splinter. They imploded inward in an instantaneous cloud of dust and flying shrapnel. The heavy iron bolts holding the hinges together shearing off like dry twigs. High on the stone ramparts, the rebel defenders froze mid-shout, their bows dropping slack in their hands. They had spent months preparing for a grueling siege of attrition that would last for weeks. The mechanical fury of the wall breaker had ended it in a single second. The timber, it's just blown to dust. Attalus stared in disbelief, his jaw going slack. The old ways of war have just died right here in the mud. By the gods, Attalus breathed aloud, slowly drawing his broadsword as the shockwave washed over them. The walls are no longer walls. Perdiccas turned to his general, his expression hard, unyielding, and aged far beyond his 15 years. Let Ptolemy hide behind his gold and his council chambers, Perdiccas thought, watching the dust settle over the ruined gate. The army belongs to the man who breaks the walls. The steel princes do not wait for gates to open, General, Perdiccas said aloud. We remove them. Now, lead the phalanx through the breach. Let them see that the true Argead power does not negotiate with stone. As the Macedonian infantry surged forward with a battle roar, pouring through the shattered gateway in a disciplined river of bronze and iron, Attalus looked back once at the humming engine, and then at the young king marching at the head of the host. He realized with a chilling clarity that the world had irrevocably changed. War was no longer solely about the raw muscle and bravery of a man's arm. It had become a game dictated by the cold, calculating weight of the machine. This first trial by fire had proven an undeniable truth. The young king possessed a devastating modern power that the regent in Pella could never hope to match. The air in the chamber was thick with the scent of burning cedar and the unspoken tension of a court divided. Regent Ptolemy sat upon the secondary throne, his fingers drumming restlessly on the armrest. He had heard the whispers coming from the west, rumors of a shattering at Orestus, of stone gates reduced to dust, but he lacked the official reports that his own spies had failed to deliver. Damn Attalus and his secret dispatches, Ptolemy thought, a cold sweat breaking out across his neck as he felt the invisible net tightening around his throne. If the boy has actually broken Orestus without my authorization, the entire military command in the West will start looking to Perdiccas instead of me. My regency becomes a joke overnight. The heavy bronze doors swung open. Queen Eurydice entered, her stride deliberate and her expression one of cold, crystalline triumph. She held a single scroll, sealed not with the regent's mark, but with the Argead lion. Let him choke on his ledgers and his stolen palace, Eurydice thought, savoring the pale, rigid tension in Ptolemy's face as she approached the dais. He thought locking Philip away and clipping my son's wings would make us compliant pets. He didn't realize the fire was already lit. The border at Orestus has been secured, Regent Eurydice announced, her voice echoing off the high stone walls. The rebellion that you claimed would take a season to suppress was ended in a single dawn. My son, the king, has proven that the blood of Amyntas does not require permission to protect its own soil. Ptolemy shifted, his eyes narrowing into cold slits as he fought to keep his composure. She walks in here like she already wears the crown, Ptolemy calculated internally, his mind racing through escape routes and countermeasures. If I dispute this, I look weak. If I accept it, I legitimize a rival army right on our doorstep. A minor skirmish against a rabble of hillmen, Eurydice Ptolemy countered aloud, forcing an indifferent sneer. It hardly justifies the unusual resources the boy has been diverting to Argead. It justifies everything, Eurydice countered, stepping closer to the dais, her eyes flashing with vindication. The northern army is restless. They see the Illyrians encroaching on our grain lands while you send ambassadors to beg for peace. They have seen Perdiccas break a gate that your generals called impregnable. If you wish to maintain the illusion of this regency, you will sign this decree. She unrolled the scroll onto the table between them. It was a formal commission granting Perdiccas III full command of the northern frontier army. She has cornered me, Ptolemy realized, a heavy stone dropping in his stomach as he surveyed the silent, watching guards along the perimeter of the hall. Their eyes aren't on me anymore. They are looking at the Argead seal. If I refuse her here, the guards won't wait for a decree. They'll drag me out into the courtyard. Give him the border, Ptolemy, she whispered, her voice a lethal caress that only he could hear. Let him face the Illyrians. If he fails, you are rid of a rival. But if you deny him now, after Orestus, the army will not ask for your seal. They will simply follow the king who knows how to win. A trap either way, Ptolemy thought bitterly. If he wins in the north, he is an untouchable hero. If he dies, the army will blame me for sending him out unsupported. Ptolemy looked down at the scroll, then past Eurydice to the silent, watching guards, men whose loyalties had visibly shifted the moment the word Orestus was spoken. He realized that Eurydice had checkmated him. By winning a trial by fire at Orestus, Perdiccas had gained the one currency the regent couldn't counterfeit, the raw, unyielding respect of the soldiers. With a slow, deliberate movement, Ptolemy reached for his signet ring, the heavy gold cold against his trembling fingers. The Steel Prince was no longer a ward. He was now a general of the realm. The balance of power in Pella had shifted irrevocably. The awakening of the northern army. The morning frost still clung to the iron-tipped spears of the northern army as 3,000 veterans stood in silent, shivering ranks. These were hard men, survivors of a decade of Illyrian raids and shifting loyalties. At the front of the formation stood the senior captains, men whose faces were maps of scars and skepticism. Look at him, veteran Captain Leonidas thought, his hard, weathered eyes narrowing as he watched the 15-year-old king ride into their midst. A boy playing soldier in a king's coat. Ptolemy sends him north to keep him out of the capital's hair, but a camp full of hardened border killers doesn't give a damn about royal blood. If he stumbles today, they'll eat him alive. The silence was broken by the rhythmic thud of hooves. Perdiccas rode into the center of the square, flanked by the Steel Princes. He didn't wear the ornate robes of a boy king. He wore a seasoned cuirass of boiled leather and bronze. Behind him, pulled by teams of heavy oxen, were 4 covered wagons. They expect a speech about honor and the glory of the Argead crown, Perdiccas thought, his grip tightening on his reins as he scanned the sea of scarred, impassive faces. Words won't buy me their loyalty. They've buried too many kings for words. I have to show them that I am not just a ruler hiding behind their shields. I am the one giving them the power to win. Captains of the North, Perdiccas' voice was clear, cutting through the morning mist. For too long, we have fought the Illyrians with nothing but our chests and our courage. We have watched them retreat into their stone nests, laughing while we bled at their gates. He signaled to the wagons. The canvas covers were thrown back, revealing the Scorpion's refined torsion engines from the Argead foundry, gleaming wickedly in the pale dawn light. What in the name of the gods is that contraption? A grizzled veteran in the front rank muttered under his breath. exchanging a skeptical glance with his shield mate. Looks like a carpenter's nightmare, not a weapon of war. This is not a bow, Perdiccas said, dismounting and walking toward the lead engine, his boots crunching on the frozen mud. He beckoned to a grizzled captain named Leonidas. Captain, come. Look at the heart of this beast. He calls me out directly, Leonidas noted, stepping forward with cautious curiosity. Bold, or reckless. The Syracusan engineers, looking like soot-stained sorcerers, stepped forward. They pointed to the bronze washers and the massive coils of braided hair and sinew. He uses the same principle as the oblique phalanx our brothers study in the south, Perdiccas explained, his hand resting firmly on the heavy timber frame. He concentrates force. While you hold the enemy's attention with the pike line, these machines will pick off their chieftains and shatter their battlements from a distance where their arrows cannot reach us. He talks like a seasoned general, not a child of the palace, Leonidas realized, reaching out to touch the cold, iron-shod bolt of the scorpion. He looked from the intricate mechanics of the machine up to the young king's steady, unblinking eyes. "We are soldiers, my lord," Leonidas said aloud, his voice gravelly and testing. "We trust in the spear, then trust in a spear that travels with the speed of a thunderbolt," Perdiccas countered without a flinch. "These engineers are now part of your command. They will eat with your men and march with your scouts. We are no longer an army that merely defends, we are an army that dismantles." He isn't asking for permission, he's issuing an order, Leonidas thought, a slow, grudging respect beginning to thaw the skepticism in his chest. The boy has steel in his spine after all. A low murmur of approval rippled through the ranks as the veterans watched the king stand shoulder to shoulder with them in the mud, treating the machines not as royal toys but as tools of survival. For the first time in years, the northern army didn't feel like a sacrificial shield left to rot by a divided court in Pella. They felt like a weapon being sharpened. Perdiccas had given them more than a machine. He had given them the initiative. The northern army is evolving into the world's first mechanized force. The morning air was brittle with frost. Below the ridge, a war band of 300 Illyrian raiders moved through the narrow valley, hooting and whistling as they drove a massive herd of stolen Macedonian cattle toward the mountain passes. They moved with the confidence of predators who had long treated the northern border as their own larder. The man leading them, clad in heavy bear fur and gleaming bronze, was not King Perdiccas, the grand and calculating sovereign of the Dardanian Illyrians. He was merely a local wall band leader and regional raiding captain, a minor warlord taking opportunistic advantage of the porous northern frontier, wholly unaware that the tactical rules of engagement had just changed. They did not look at the ridgeline. They expected a desperate charge of Macedonian levies that they could easily outmaneuver in the broken terrain. They did not expect the scorpions. Hidden behind a screen of pine branches, Perdiccas stood with Captain Leonidas. 4 of these new bolt shooters had been disassembled and carried up the goat paths during the night, then reassembled in the silence of the dark. "Range is 300 paces, the chief engineer whispered, his hand on the winch. "Gravity will carry the bolts down the slope. We have the advantage of the height." Perdiccas raised his hand. The Illyrian raiding captain paused below, laughing at a joke made by his lieutenant as he unslung his waterskin. "Fire," Perdiccas commanded. The 4 engines released simultaneously. The whip-crack sound echoed through the valley like a mountain collapse. 4 iron-shod bolts, each 4 feet long, hissed through the air. One struck the raiding captain squarely in the chest, pinning him to the earth before he could even drop his waterskin. The others tore through the raider's center, the sheer kinetic energy of the torsion-driven projectiles shattering bone and bronze alike. The Illyrians panicked. They looked for the archers who could shoot with such terrifying force, but there were no archers to be seen, only the silent, wooded ridge. Second volley. "Spread the fire," Leonidas roared. As the second flight of bolts whistled down, turning the valley floor into a killing field, the stolen cattle stampeded in terror, trampling the remaining raiders. Perdiccas didn't wait for a third shot. He drew his sword, and the hidden Macedonian infantry rose from the brush like ghosts. "For the Argeads," the king cried, leading the downhill charge into the chaos. By the time the sun fully crested the peaks, the valley was silent. The cattle had been recovered, and not a single Illyrian raider had reached the pass. Captain Leonidas walked among the fallen, looking at a bolt that had punched through a heavy wicker shield and the man behind it. He looked up at Perdiccas with a new grim respect. "The border has moved today, my king," Leonidas said, cleaning his blade. "The Illyrians will tell tales of the spears that fly like lightning. They won't be so quick to cross the Axius again." Before the campaign began, Perdiccas had quietly diverted crown funds to the royal workshops of Argead, commissioning a domestic corps of southern mechanics to forge a lighter, transportable evolution of the heavy siege engines. Compact bolt shooters designed specifically to give the northern infantry a mobile, long-range advantage in the rugged highlands. Now, those experimental machines had drawn their first blood. The Scorpions had proven their lethality, and the Northern Army has found its teeth. To be continued in episode 22, Shattered Illusion. Watch and listen now. Watch the cinematic video trailer. Listen to the full saga now. Bookmark Volume 1, Talesia's Playlist. Volume 2, Hieros Lachus, the Sacred Band Playlist. Bookmark Volume 1, Divine Oracle Playlist. Join the Vanguard. A new episode drops every single day until the epic conclusion of Volume 2. Each chapter delivers a tight, hyper-focused 10 to 30-minute hit of cinematic historical drama, perfect for your daily plunge into antiquity. Subscribe to follow the bloody rise of the Argead dynasty. Thumbs up to help push our vanguard through the algorithm's gauntlet. Comment below.